So picture this, it's 1920. You're a British banker in a mahogany-paneled office in London, sipping tea from porcelain so fine you can see through it. Outside your window, the sun literally never sets on your empire. You control a quarter of the world's land and population. You're convinced, absolutely convinced, that nothing can touch you. Now fast forward 40 years. That same empire, crumbling like a stale biscuit. And here's the thing, it wasn't just wars or independence movements that did it. No, the British Empire committed financial suicide, one spectacular mistake at a time. Today, we peep into history to see the 7 money disasters that turned the world's greatest superpower into, well, an island that makes decent TV shows. And before you come at me in the comments saying, but what about this or you forgot that, stick around. We'll talk about the controversial ones historians still argue about at the end. But first, let's talk about how the British basically wrote the playbook on how not to run an economy. Let's watch an empire burn through its bank account. Mistake number 1. The gold standard disaster of 1925. Or should I say, how to choke your economy to death. Now imagine you're wearing shoes that are 2 sizes too small. They look fantastic, absolutely stunning, but every step is agony. That's essentially what Britain did to its entire economy in 1925. Winston Churchill, the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, that Churchill, before he became everyone's favorite wartime hero, made what he would later call the biggest mistake of his life. He put Britain back on the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. But wait, you're thinking, wasn't the gold standard supposed to be like a good thing? Stability and all that? Sure, if you ignore basic economics. Here's what actually happened. Churchill pegged the pound at $4.86, which was about 10% higher than market reality. It's like insisting your used Honda is worth the price of a new Mercedes because, well, it used to be worth that much. The result? British exports became ridiculously expensive overnight. Picture a British factory owner in Manchester watching his orders evaporate as American and German competitors undercut his prices by simply existing. Coal, steel, textiles, all priced out of international markets. Unemployment exploded. Workers took pay cuts or lost their jobs entirely. The 1926 general strike wasn't just workers being dramatic, it was millions of people watching their livelihoods disappear, because some suits in London wanted to feel nostalgic about pre-war exchange rates. And here's where it gets darkly funny. The whole point was to restore confidence in British financial supremacy. Instead, it advertised to the world that Britain would rather cling to past glory than deal with present reality. It's like showing up to a job interview in your grandfather's suit from 1910, refusing to acknowledge that fashion and the world had moved on. The gold standard straitjacket kept the British economy gasping for air for 6 years until they finally abandoned it in 1931. By then, the damage was done. Competitors had grabbed market share, workers were radicalized, and Britain's industrial base had begun its long, slow decline. Tell me in the comments, would you tank your entire economy just to prove a point about past glory? Because that's essentially what happened here. Mistake number 2. Loving money abroad more than industry at home. Here's a fun fact that should make you wince. By 1913, Britain had invested 32% of its entire national wealth overseas. 1/3. Let that sink in. Now imagine you're a British investor in 1900. You've got money to invest. Option A, put it into a factory in Birmingham that makes things, employs people, and builds your country's industrial capacity. Option B, stick it in Argentine railways or South African mines that pay slightly better returns. British investors consistently chose option B. And honestly, can you blame them? The financial system was set up to make foreign investment easy and sexy, while domestic manufacturing was seen as, well, beneath people of class. This is where things get sociologically fascinating. Britain's elite were attending schools where they learned Latin and Greek, not engineering or chemistry. The smart kids went into banking, law, or civil service. Manufacturing? That was for the lower classes, darling. Meanwhile, in Germany and America, their best minds were designing factories, developing new technologies, and building industrial empires. They were getting their hands dirty while British gentlemen were calculating interest rates on tea plantations in Ceylon. The result? British industry aged like milk in the sun. By 1870, American factories were already 50% more productive than British ones. By World War I, that gap had doubled. Britain was still using techniques from the First Industrial Revolution, while everyone else had moved on to the Second. Here's what kills me about this. The money was there. Britain was rich. But instead of reinvesting in the industries that had made them rich in the first place, they became a nation of landlords and bankers, living off rent from the rest of the world. It's like inheriting a successful restaurant chain and deciding to sell all the locations to invest in cryptocurrency. Sure, you might make some quick returns, but you're gutting the thing that actually produces value. And the British financial establishment was so disconnected from manufacturing that they literally, and I mean literally, had no idea what domestic industries needed. John Maynard Keynes himself pointed out that British banks showed total ignorance about investment opportunities in their own manufacturing sector. Think about that. The people controlling the money didn't understand the businesses that made things. Just think of having a hospital run by people who've never studied medicine. Now let's pause right here. Do you think this could happen today to any country you know? Is it already happening? Drop your thoughts. I've got some uncomfortable parallels to modern economies that we might explore in future videos. Mistake number 3. World War I. The most expensive victory in history. World War I was where the British Empire essentially took out a mortgage that it could never repay. You see, in 1914, Britain was the world's banker. The pound sterling was the global currency. British naval supremacy was unquestioned. The empire was swimming in wealth from centuries of colonial exploitation and industrial dominance. 4 years later, Britain was broke. We are not talking about let's tighten the belt broke, not let's skip the fancy vacation broke. No, we're talking in debt to America up to your eyeballs and printing money to avoid complete collapse kind of broke. The numbers are genuinely staggering. Britain's national debt went from about 26% of GDP in 1914 to 187.5% by 1922. Imagine your personal debt going from manageable credit cards to owing more than you'll earn in the next 2 years. Now multiply that by an entire empire. But here's what the textbooks don't emphasize enough. It wasn't just the monetary cost. The war obliterated Britain's economic position in more subtle, more permanent ways. Remember all those lucrative trading relationships? Gone. German markets? Lost to America. Asian markets? Japan moved in. South American markets? The United States said, thank you very much, we'll take it from here, and indeed took over. Britain spent 4 years fighting Germany, while America spent 4 years replacing Britain as everyone's favorite trade partner. And you know the really tragic part? Britain actually won the war but lost the economic peace. Germany, on the other hand, despite losing, restructured and modernized. Britain, despite winning, clung to the old ways, the old empire, the old systems that were already obsolete. Imagine you are a British government official in 1919, looking at the books. From what you see, the empire still looks bigger than ever on paper. They'd just picked up German colonies and Ottoman territories. But the treasury was empty, the industrial base was exhausted, workers were demanding better conditions, and the whole creaking system was held together by American loans and sheer imperial momentum. It's like winning a poker tournament, but going into massive debt to do it, only to realize the game has changed, and everyone's playing blackjack now. The war also did something more psychological. It shattered the myth of European superiority. Millions of colonial subjects had fought for the empire, seen European civilization tear itself apart in the trenches, and returned home thinking, wait, why are we taking orders from these people again? The bill for World War I would keep coming due for decades. But Britain wasn't done making expensive mistakes. Not even close. Mistake number 4. The Suez Crisis. Let's fast forward to 1956. Britain is planning a comeback story. Egyptian President Nasser has just nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain's crucial shortcut to its Asian empire and oil supplies. Prime Minister Anthony Eden, desperate to prove Britain still matters, conspires with France and Israel to invade Egypt and take the canal back. It's going to be glorious. Britain will show the world it's still a major power. The empire will roar again. Except, America said no. To put it nicely, more like sit down, shut up, and get out of Egypt before we destroy your currency. Here's what happened, President Eisenhower, absolutely furious that Britain had launched this adventure without consulting America, and during an election year, no less, threatened to sell America's massive reserves of British pounds. This would have crashed the pound's value overnight, triggering a complete financial crisis. Britain and France, in the middle of their military operation, with troops on the ground and tanks rolling, had to stop. Just stop. Withdraw. Humiliated in front of the entire world. Let that sink in. Britain, France, and Israel were winning militarily. But America pulled their financial plug, and that was that. This is the moment, the very moment, when everyone realized the British Empire was finished. Not declining, not weakening, actually done. The global power structure had shifted, and Britain was now in the passenger seat at best. Imagine being Anthony Eden. You've just been Prime Minister for less than 2 years. You're trying to recapture some of that Churchill glory. You launch what you think is a decisive military operation. And America, your supposed ally, your closest partner, financially kneecaps you in front of the entire world. Eden resigned within months, his health shattered, his reputation destroyed. But here's the deeper financial lesson. The Suez Crisis revealed that Britain had been playing pretend for years. The empire existed on maps and in rhetoric, but the actual power, the ability to act independently, to enforce your will, to matter, required money that Britain simply didn't have anymore. They'd spent it all. 2 world wars, maintaining colonies that cost more than they generated, failed economic policies, and the simple passage of time had drained the treasury. Britain was like a broke aristocrat living in a crumbling mansion, pretending the butler and maids hadn't left years ago. The Suez Crisis was the moment the pretense died, and everyone was watching. Question for you, can you think of modern examples where economic power trumps military power? Because this dynamic is still playing out today in different forms. Mistake number 5, World War II. If World War I sent Britain into debt, World War II put it on financial life support. The numbers are almost absurd. By 1946, Britain's national debt hit 1.8% of GDP. For perspective, that's worse than modern Greece at the height of its debt crisis. Britain had literally spent more than twice what its entire economy could produce in a year. But it gets worse. To fight the war, Britain had to liquidate overseas assets, beg for American aid through the Lend-Lease program, which, despite the name, wasn't exactly generous. America charged interest and mortgaged its entire economic future. Here's the part that really stings. Britain fought heroically. The resistance to Hitler was morally necessary, strategically crucial, and historically lionized. Britain stood alone in 1940. The courage was real. The sacrifice was genuine. And it bankrupted them. Winston Churchill in 1945, finally victorious after 6 years of total war. Britain had won. Hitler was dead. The Nazi regime was destroyed. And Britain was completely, utterly broke. The empire couldn't maintain itself anymore. Within 2 years, India, the jewel in the crown, the centerpiece of the entire imperial project, gained independence. Not because Britain wanted to grant it, but because Britain couldn't afford to keep it. Burma, Ceylon, Palestine, gone within a few years. The reason was not some sort of enlightened realization that colonialism was wrong, though some Brits did realize that, but because the money had run out. It's like being forced to sell your car, your house, and your furniture, not because you've learned material possessions don't matter, but because the debt collectors are literally at the door, and you're out of options. The American loan of 1945, which Britain needed just to avoid immediate financial collapse, came with strings attached. America insisted on the end of imperial trade preferences. The empire as an economic unit was dismantled by the very ally who'd helped save it from Hitler. And here's the cruel irony. Britain spent decades after the war paying off American loans for a war effort that had destroyed its economy, while Germany and Japan, the losers, received Marshall Plan aid and rebuilt into modern economic powerhouses. Britain won the war, but lost its empire, its economic dominance, and its position at the center of world affairs. The victory parade must have felt awfully hollow when the bills came due. Mistake number 6, the American colonial disaster. So let's rewind to 1783, because Britain's financial incompetence has deep roots. The American Revolution wasn't just a military defeat, it was an economic revelation that Britain stubbornly refused to learn from. Here's what happened. Britain fought an expensive war across an ocean to keep colonies that, when you actually did the math, cost more to maintain than they generated in revenue. The occupation costs, the military expenses, the administrative overhead, it all added up to a net loss. The American colonies were supposed to exist for Britain's benefit, right? That was the whole point of mercantilism. The colonies provide raw materials, buy British manufactured goods, and everybody's happy. Except Britain was spending enormous sums to defend and administer territories that could have simply been trading partners. After losing America, some British thinkers had a radical idea. Hey, maybe colonies aren't actually that profitable. Maybe we should just trade with people instead of conquering and occupying them. But did Britain learn this lesson? Did they think, wow, maybe this whole empire thing is more expensive than it's worth? Nope, they doubled down. If anything, the loss of America made them more aggressive about acquiring and holding other territories. We lost those colonies, so we need to grab more to make up for it. It's like losing money at a casino and deciding the solution is to gamble bigger. The 19th century saw Britain expand the empire to its greatest extent, convinced that more territory equals more wealth. And sure, some colonies were profitable, usually the ones that could be ruthlessly exploited with minimal British presence. But most Most were expensive liabilities dressed up as assets. India, for example, required an entire administrative system, a massive military presence, extensive infrastructure investments, and constant expenses. The profits went to private companies and individual British merchants, while the costs were borne by British taxpayers. It's essentially a massive shell game where the empire looked impressive on maps, generated wealth for specific people, but didn't actually benefit the average British citizen or the national treasury as much as the propaganda suggested. And here's the thing that should keep modern powers awake at night. Britain kept pouring money into maintaining this empire long after it stopped making economic sense, simply because admitting the empire was a money pit would have been psychologically devastating. Pride is expensive, and Britain paid retail. Wait a minute. Does any of this sound like anything happening in modern day? Mistake number 7, the cultural contempt for actually making things. See, this is the mistake that doesn't show up in budget spreadsheets, but it might be the most devastating of all. Somewhere along the way, Britain developed a collective attitude that making things was beneath its dignity. Think about it. Britain invented the Industrial Revolution. British innovations literally changed human civilization. Steam engines, textile machinery, railways. Britain was the workshop of the world. And then British culture decided that being a gentleman meant not working with your hands, not understanding manufacturing, and not dirtying yourself with actual production. The elite sent their sons to schools that taught Latin, Greek, and classics. Engineering? That's for the Germans. Chemistry? Leave it to the Americans. The truly successful British person became a banker, a lawyer, or a colonial administrator. You managed money or people, but you didn't make things. Meanwhile, America was building a culture that celebrated inventors and industrialists. Germany was developing technical universities that produced world-class engineers. These countries were getting better at making things, while Britain was getting better at talking about how they used to be good at making things. By the early 20th century, British productivity was falling behind everyone. The factories were outdated. The techniques were old. The equipment was wearing out. And the people with money to invest were putting it anywhere except the industries that actually produced goods. It's a form of collective delusion. Britain remained convinced of its industrial supremacy long after it had been surpassed, because the alternative, admitting they'd been overtaken, was too painful to contemplate. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine if Silicon Valley decided that actually building technology was beneath them, and all the smart people went into finance and law instead of engineering. How long would America's tech dominance last? That's essentially what happened to Britain with manufacturing. The saddest part? The knowledge was there. The capability existed. Britain could have modernized, could have invested in industry, could have trained engineers and scientists instead of classic scholars and colonial administrators. But culture is a powerful thing, and British culture had decided that gentlemen don't work in factories. By the time they realized this attitude was destroying their economic base, the competition had a generational head start. The 3 historians can't agree on. Now remember I promised we'd talk about the controversial ones? Here they are, briefly. The Darien Scheme of 1698 was Scotland's catastrophic attempt to establish a colony in Panama. A quarter of Scottish capital went into this disaster, and it failed spectacularly, helping to push Scotland into union with England. Some historians see this as a formative disaster for British imperial economics. Others argue it happened too early to really matter to the later empire's decline. The specific decision-making around decolonization timing is disputed. Some argue Britain gave up colonies too quickly after World War II, losing potential recovery assets. Others insist Britain held on too long, wasting money on colonial wars it couldn't afford. The counterfactuals are impossible to prove either way. Finally, the degree to which normal imperial overreach versus specific policy mistakes caused the decline is endlessly debated. Was the empire doomed by the nature of empires? Or could different choices have extended British dominance? Historians will be arguing about this for another century. But ignore that for a second. Look at the bigger picture. This is what's genuinely interesting about the British Empire's financial downfall. It wasn't one catastrophic mistake. It was a series of choices that made sense in the moment, driven by pride, cultural assumptions, and the difficulty of adapting when you're on top. The gold standard seemed like restoring order. Foreign investment seemed more profitable than domestic industry. Fighting wars seemed necessary. Holding colonies seemed like strength. Cultural attitudes seemed natural. But all of it together created a doom spiral. Each mistake made the next one more likely, more damaging, more difficult to reverse. The British Empire fell because it spent more than it made, invested in the past instead of the future, and convinced itself that prestige could substitute for productivity. Sound familiar? Because these aren't historical lessons. These are ongoing temptations for every dominant power. The question isn't whether Britain made mistakes. The question is whether current powers are making the same ones right now, in slow motion, too proud or too blind to see it. I'm Malcolm, and this is History Meets Economics. What do you think? Are there modern parallels to these mistakes? Which of these 7 do you think was the most damaging? And am I being too harsh on Britain, or not harsh enough? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe if you want more economic history that actually matters to today. And remember, the sun may have set on the British Empire, but the lessons never get old. Here's another moment. History met economics.